Well, there's a little bit of sort of facilities management I didn't get right. I didn't check out the podium first. It's fine. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and now I feel nice and relaxed and chilled. Thanks very much. I think it was Julie. Thank you for that. And I'm very interested in making sure there isn't a shitty workplace, so I suppose that's something to think about. Thanks to all the team from the summit. I think it's very important to have events like this and to ensure that we have these kind of conversations. And thank you for allowing me to have a platform to speak about inclusion and diversity in the workplace today. I suppose a few thoughts. The drive to make workplaces more diverse is often rooted in social justice. So where did all this start? I suppose it's come from that experience of some of the thinkers and the academics over the last 40, 50 years, the Porters, the Cotters, people who tried to sort of think about how do we make the world a little bit different. And awareness of the business case for inclusion is also on the rise. So you hear about this a lot. People, I suppose, there's a lot of trite conversations. So what's the truth and where do we find ourselves in it? And a lot of people talk about it as a sort of a source of competitive advantage and the enabler of growth. I wanted to refer first of all to a couple of studies because I think it's just good to think a little bit about the data and the facts. McKinsey, who as many of you know certainly get the facts fairly right, would say that for a lot of organisations they do not invest in this area. So when they look at the data that it tells them, there's a lot of conversation around diversity and inclusion, but the actual investment is quite low. And in a most recent survey, companies in the top quartile of executive level gender worldwide had a 21% likelihood of outperforming their fourth quarter industry peers in earnings before interest and tax, and a 27% likelihood of outperforming on a longer term value creation. So this is, when people did this, in this space, this was the kind of results. And I suppose I just wanted to kind of talk about that, less than maybe the boring facts, but it sets the topic for this organisation, this kind of conversation that we're going to have. And I want to look at maybe how are we doing this, is it working well, and are there some operational things we need to think about? So telling you a little bit about my own background in this space, maybe elicate a few of my thoughts around that. The great writer Proust, who many of you will know, said the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new lands, but in seeking those with new eyes. And that's very true for me. I think I saw things differently from a very young age. I grew up in rural County Limerick in the 70s, and in the 80s, I was certainly a very curious child, curious as to why things were a certain way and why things were defined. I probably spent most of my early life questioning, and my parents would probably say that I was an annoyance because I was always questioning why everything was the way it was. I remember at a young age sort of challenging my mum about why we had to go to church and why I had to even be a Catholic. And these days that's something I can make some freedom about, but as a child you don't. And really what I struggled with there was the administration, where I saw females in it, the respectability of our community, its implications and fitting in. And I knew I was anxious to grow up and get out, and to be honest I did as soon as I could. I finished school and college. I'm trying to make a very long story very short. I went exploring a bit on my own journey, and one of those sort of emergences or coming to terms was that I realised and understood and acknowledged that I was a gay woman. And I rallied against that for a very long time. Mostly, I believe, because I was afraid of the convention and of breaking the rules and not sort of fitting into that respectable world. And the fears of, you know, it being illegal until 1993, losing your job and being bullied and harassed. So what that has done for me is to help me to maybe have a little bit of understanding about people who are perhaps not bringing all of themselves into their work. And you need to frame that, of course, in 1980s Ireland, so it was a different time. I was chatting with somebody last night, for instance, from the UK, and we were talking about some of the changes around Brexit and people and, you know, what makes Ireland special, because this chap believed that Ireland was pretty special, particularly around inclusion. And we were saying, you know, well, you should have seen things 20 years ago or 25 years ago. You know, we're pretty still in our infancy around some of the things that we're doing. I got involved with Sodexo many, many years ago, but particularly around the diversity and inclusion work around 15 years ago. And I found that a real area that sort of opened my eyes to this world. you know, I had thought about it before, but I hadn't really understood what a difference it could make. And the reason I got involved was that our organisation were looking to replicate some of what we were doing in the US, and we'd been very advanced in the US in this, but not in the UK and Ireland and European region. So I got involved to kind of bring the Irish voice to it, and I think that was a real opportunity for me. So again, when we reflect about things you can do for yourself and how you perhaps emerge your voice in this, it's something to think about. Here I found a lot of people who were open, who were living the values, and who were really having some challenging conversations. So the first time I was going, okay, this is pretty okay, we can talk about all these things we're not talking about normally. And that change for me meant that I came back to my workplace thinking, okay, you know, perhaps I can come out and work, perhaps I can have this conversation. I was having challenging conversations around, you know, race and many other things. And I began to have a sense of excitement that, you know, things could be different. There was no definite outcome of what the future looked like, but I saw a real emergence of challenge, of change and different thinking. And I suppose, like a lot of things, once that happens to you, it's very hard to go back. And so that was very personal. And you know, I began to come out in my work life and in my personal life. And I had been very private in that sense, so that was a bit of a change. But probably the thing that was, I suppose, I think the real enabler was that when I was coming to work, I was most definitely, I think, more productive, because I was actually being somebody who was very free about what was happening in my life and not actually hiding that. And you know, that happened around so many things, talking about and with colleagues around disability, race and so many other issues, and I think that certainly helped. So that gives you a bit of a picture of my personal journey and I suppose around my involvement in diversity and inclusion. And those words, diversity and inclusion, are sort of bandied around a bit. I mean, for me, the very simple definition is diversity is understanding that we have enough of people who are different. So we've got a lot of different thinking, different looks, different orientation, different abilities, and so many other things. And the inclusion is just making sure that it's very inclusive. And I think it helps me to look at organisations. And at the moment, in our organisation, just like everybody else, we're going through a huge amount of change. And I think it's very important to think about our organisations in this way. Bigger global organisations in the main, some of them are, you know, deeply involved and some less. Some are very mature in this space, and some are approaching this with a high level of authenticity and leader-led passion. We see much variance. We're also seeing a lot of other organisations giving lip service to all of this, or none at all. It was interesting. Last year I was at an event in Dublin, and I was sitting with somebody, you know, we were talking about SMEs, and it was quite interesting chatting about the SME environment, how, you know, in my view, certainly from chatting to these people, how there was a lack of awareness around inclusion. And the struggle, of course, was, if we want to do this, how do we do this in a small organisation? How do we do this in a small company? And I think there are ways around that. It's understandable that resources are often the main challenge, because there's a lack of knowledge and people are fearful about getting into this kind of world. How do I have that discussion? How do I make a way around it? However, I think it's absolutely fundamental to the world we're living in. And I know that from this morning in chatting with some of my colleagues, there's been some really interesting and challenging discussions about, you know, how well, whether there'll be grass or not, and what food is like, and what the built environment is like. We're all working at the moment in buildings, and in the main we work with human beings, so that centres us back to this. And in truth, our buildings do not always cater for everybody. So, you know, they're built very standardised, they're built for the average person, they're probably designed by somebody who has moved away from the whole process once they've actually gone away and gone on to the next project. And they haven't always thought about the human dimension. And they're for the standard user rather than the variety of us, and there's a lot of variety of us. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Sinead Burke. She's a blogger, and she was in Davos recently, and she was talking about herself and her position in that she's a small person, and that's how she refers to herself, and trying to navigate her way around a building as a small person. And I was chatting to her about this, and she said, you know, for instance, if she goes into a building and she goes to use the facilities, particularly with, say, the washroom, etc., quite often she can't actually get out because she can't actually even reach the handles and the doors. Nobody ever thinks about that when they're actually building a building. Do they think about where the buttons for the lift are? Do they think about the environment? Or another one to think about, I don't know if any of you are aware of an organisation called As I Am, that's run by Adam Harris. And Adam Harris and the team really work with a lot of people around the autism spectrum and many different formats around that. So people who struggle with light and noise and how the building is set up. Do we think about when they come even to an interview, how we set up the interview? Because quite often it's very daunting for somebody who has autism, so therefore they don't even enter into the process. And when they do come, have we set it up right for, you know, the world they think about and feel comfortable about? Because we try to put everybody into the same format. And I think the key part about all that is we're missing out on talent. So there's a recent example from one of the big professional firms here in Dublin, one of the professional services firms. They did a piece of work in this area, and what they found was suddenly they had candidates, when they thought about this, they had candidates they had never before actually had access to when they actually tried to change the dynamics of how this was set up. And they hired a number of engineers who had autism or who were on that spectrum, who came in and worked with them, who absolutely turned out to be amazing. But they would never have gone through the traditional process. And they've had to flex their building around that. So it's not just about setting up buildings and workplaces for disability, but rather ability. So we need to think about how do we make it for people who are able. Because, you know, we always think about people who are perhaps in a wheelchair or maybe crutches or something like that, but we don't think about the rest of the building. We need to think about collaboration, productivity and inclusivity. So again, lots of questions, and I know you'll all read it out there in the, you know, the facilities magazines, all of this sort of thing, around are our modern workplaces really set up for collaboration? So we've got this third space, we've got open plan, does it really work? So, you know, everything that's advanced isn't always good, and I think we need to think about it with that reflex. I think it makes good business sense to have an employee base that looks like our customers, and again, it's something important to think about. So for all of you who are, you know, perhaps in your own organisations, are you thinking about that when you actually go out into the world of tendering? Because it's certainly something that the bigger companies think about, it's certainly something our client base thinks about. You know, are you actually looking at who is in your team, what they actually bring to the discussion, and who are you actually approaching? Are your team going to be able to serve the populations that you're asking them to do? And are they diverse enough? And are your supplier base diverse enough? And are your vendors diverse enough? So whatever spectrum of this that you're involved in, you perhaps need to think about that and challenge that. Particularly, I think, with your supplier base, are they bringing enough of that? Even down to something like, you know, are they, for instance, in Ireland, bringing small, medium enterprises into things, and are they thinking about that? The business case for attracting a wider range of employees will only get stronger as the country grows more diverse. And if you look at the stats even out from IBEC yesterday, we're getting to the bottom of the line. There is virtually so few people left to employ who are available for labour here. So we need to see and think differently about how we go for that, because this unprecedented growth that we're having, you know, we're not going to be able to fulfill this. And as you know, we have all the problems around logistics and the city and the capital, for instance, that we're in. It's also, for me, around innovation and performance. It's about, does this bring innovation? I absolutely do think it does. And it's backed by years of sociology and a lot more thinking around that. And it's about creating shared values by working together on a common mission, taking one small step at a time. And the mission is bigger and more complex than individual roles and responsibilities. So when you think about hiring, I take that as an example. Hiring should not be just the job of HR or somebody who's in the talent. You need to think about, are you influencing hiring? Are you part of that discussion? Are you making sure there's enough diversity? And I'm not talking about just getting gender diversity. Have you got enough gender? Have you got enough, for instance, ethnic diversity? Have you got people around ability? Have you set it up for people with different elements of the spectrum? And all of these things. The members of tomorrow's workforce, I think, you know, they're already working with us, but we need to think about what they think that's important. Purpose is absolutely so important. And they want to harness that productivity, and companies want to do that, and we need to make sure that our strategic goals are tied up with that as well. I suppose looking at our own organisation and others that I have an insight into, I would say a lot of leadership support, a strong business case, and a team who are determined to make a change and to work and make a winning coalition. And honestly, we don't even get it right, and I would say we're doing quite well on this field. The reality is, you start with a great impetus, you try to do this, there's a lot of leadership support, but it needs a day to day to day. And if you're people on the ground and people out in the business don't believe it, it falls down. And so therefore, you know, for bigger companies like us who have done well in this space, we need to constantly re-energize this as well. And it has to be a lived experience, so it's no use if it's something that you don't do, and we all make mistakes around that. I suppose thinking about bias, and again, maybe something that you referred to earlier, but thinking about unconscious bias. What are your prejudices? What are your stereotypes? What do you think before people even start, or before you build your building? Have you even had bias in your design? And you need to influence yourself and others around that. We need to have practices to mitigate that. Education is just the beginning. Conversation is probably the best part. It's like joining a gym. You have to do the exercise daily. I think there are many new ways to get that workout. Tech tools and companies are sprouting up all over the place. And we want to hire managers and retain people and use good technology that helps us to think about that. I'm at the moment, for instance, involved in a group. We're doing some mentoring around entrepreneurs. We're using a little tool called Workin. It's really excellent. It's a little app, but that app really makes me think about things, because every time I use it and I connect with the people on it, there's different challenges put to me, different questions. So, you know, tech is helping me in a very small way around that. There's an emerging crop of innovators who are bringing those kind of tools, and we have to be open to them. It's beyond the right thing to do. It's necessary, and we need to build those blocks. I suppose just a few things that I probably think you need to think about, you know, as I kind of wind this to a close. Employees who hide who they are or how they are comes at the cost of employee engagement. Employee engagement is probably one of the big differentiators that we're all looking at to make for change. You know, what's our USP? What makes one of us, one of our organisations, one of our companies better than another? It's engagement, because if people really believe that we're different. And retention is incredibly important. So every time one of our organisations here in Ireland loses somebody, look at the cost of that loss. And it reveals broader challenges around full inclusion. So, and that's not just around sexual orientation and gender, it's so many other areas. So are people covering, are we allowing them to really be themselves? A group of major corporates, and I just reflect on this one, took an unprecedented stand in the US around the marriage equality debate a couple of years ago. So Accenture, American Express, AT&T, Barclays, and a whole lot more, GSK, Google, and so on. There were 700 companies, and they signed a petition to the US Supreme Court, and they were protesting against the state laws banning same-sex marriage. And you know what? They had things overturned. Look at the cases in South Carolina over the last number of years. Again, a number of companies said they would not relocate and invest in places like that where they tried to change the law and make it negative. And again, it overturned things. So I think companies can be a big enabler. So that's something, again, you can influence. Thinking about, does your firm allow people to work on global issues pro bono, whatever they might be, whether it's CR, D&I, whatever that might be? Do you give your people some time off to do this? Because we've only all got so many hours in the day. There are a number of firms across, particularly Europe, who are supporting their teams to do that. And what you see coming back is they bring that kind of innovation back into their workplace and business opportunities. So again, I reflect on the chap I was speaking with last night in the UK, and he was just saying in his company, he's in a law firm, and he's globally involved in a lot of this, but he has brought a lot of new partners, a lot of new, you know, relationships to their business just by having those kind of relationships. Because quite often, having conversations that are not so transactional mean that you're having a more open conversation, and that helps you to perhaps develop a business network. Things like national competitiveness. The evidence shows that inclusion is strongly linked to national economic competitiveness, and something we need to think about, particularly, I think, as organisations. Corruption. Discrimination is associated with corrupt practices. So a lack of openness, inclusion signals a country which is not a great place to do business. And again, that's something we want to do well. And I talked about innovation. I think it's incredibly important to think about consumer power. So groups that feel perhaps a little disassociated from your organisation, they are big consumers. And I probably just reflect a little bit about the LGBT community, because it's probably one of the communities I know best. So the LGBT community as a group constantly are on LinkedIn and various other sort of methods where people are talking about organisations that feel right fit for us, that feel like the kind of companies we should be doing business with, where should we be investing our money. People who are in those kind of decision-making opportunities can quite often make choices against companies who don't, for instance, feel like they exhibit the right kind of values. And you know, you look at what's happening in Brazil at the moment and some of the changes that are happening in geopolitics, I think that's going to make some influences around where people invest money. And there is a large spending strength there. Thinking about brands, new evidence demonstrates that inclusion attracts. So if you're inclusive, you attract people to your brand and you get greater loyalty among your potential employees and your consumers. And employee engagement we talked a little bit about as well, but people will go that extra mile if they feel they've got a success. And I suppose financial performance, that is most definitely true. And in our own organisation, we did a survey in 2014 and in 2017, into the end of 2017, and we looked at 50 locations around the world, and we looked at, you know, where we had pretty balanced gender and stuff like that, to see what did that tell us. And it was particularly probably looking around gender. And what we saw in those 50 entities, very similar to 2014, that those outperformed the other parts of the world where we actually had less of that. So we had more percentage points in employee engagement, our gross profit was better, and our returns were better. And certainly from a point of view of how those businesses performed out in the marketplace as well. Investment firms like BlackRock, you're all probably familiar with those, they're now saying they're only going to invest in organisations that have inclusion policies. So again, if you're looking for shareholder return, you're looking for people to invest in your business, you're trying to grow and accelerate your business, if it's your personal business, then who's going to actually invest for you? So today, for instance, you may be aware, Dell have a big event here in Dublin with women who are entrepreneurs, and they're looking at bringing investors into the room. Of course, it's going to be biased around gender in that particular case, but you know, investors are waking up to these opportunities. And procurement is now driving for inclusion as well. So if you are, for instance, even with the public bodies here in Ireland, the government is putting a lot of limits and statutes down around that as well. So if you're tendering, you need to show that you've got this kind of integration. So again, a few last things about what you can do. Be aware of your marketplace. Ensure your firm is a key player in this space, and support your teams to do it both internally and externally. So again, you need to be behind them. Think about design, think differently, invite people who might bring a different perspective to your design and planning team, involve them and be open to new ideas. Watch and review the global changes in this demographic. And we're going to see such amazing changes in demographics over there. And I mean, we've seen a little bit in the last couple of years. Look at where sort of, you know, the south of the world is coming up into the north. You look at what's going to happen, where are the countries where people are just growing at vast numbers and where they're coming to. Look what's happening around wealth. I mean, America is an interesting example. You know, 7–8% of people actually own most of the wealth. Look at what's happening in a country like this. And what does that actually signal for the future? What are the provisions for life and healthcare and investment? It's about harnessing the power of the wider diverse community, and I know some speakers spoke about that this morning. Being aware of that community and making sure it's inclusive. So how do you bring that inclusivity back in, and how does it feel real in your workplace? Continue to engage with NGOs. So when we kind of get through hard times in our businesses, we cut back on a lot of things. These NGOs can bring a lot of outside influence. It can be extremely interesting. And you know, whether it's something like Business to Arts, whether it's an organisation who's dealing with a certain area of inclusion, they still bring a bit of different thinking. It's about working to provide safe and equitable environments for healthcare, education, provision around partnership and equality for all of your teams. So again, have you got does everybody in your organisation feel that the benefits and rewards of working for your company are realised? Does it feel equal? Build on your employee engagement. You already are probably in that space, so move it to the next level, and where do you take it to? And be open to the new ideas and perhaps some of the products and services that might come from people within your team. And again, it's that very close thinking. You think it always comes from the loudest people, or perhaps those who shout more or have got influence at the top, but there's different ways of making things happen. Khalil Gibran said, "The obvious is that which is never seen until somebody expresses it simply." And I think that's a call to think about. I now believe in and see change as positive. I am absolutely convinced that we all need change. We're going through it at the moment in our own organisation. Lots of change, lots of new journeys. And it's about leaving behind a trail that helps find us the next challenge and that hopefully inspires people to do something different and to find a new paradigm. To conclude, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. Thank you for the space to have this conversation, and I hope you continue to have this conversation. And thank you, Pat, and all the team who've organised today. I think fundamental change is underway, and from what I gather in Harness, that's something you've all been talking about. And those have real meaning for our future, for our families, how we work, act and behave in our lives. And we can choose how we want to react. We can either sit and wait, or we can have it done to us. I believe if we move forward, we can really be a part of that. So thank you.